I feel, the movie itself definitely has ignited a lot of conversation. People who have not been exposed to overfishing issue in the past, and this is new to them, are definitely rethinking the way they look at seafood. They did try and cover a very complex issue.
Hello and welcome to Marine Science Cafe. Gosh, it's been a long time since I've actually said those words, and it seems like I'm going to have to live for the rest of my life with the silly name of this channel. So of course, since I don't drink coffee, as mentioned multiple times before, I've got a tea here. Today I'm super excited to introduce Andrew Lewin from the, okay, I need to get this right, Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I'm so happy that Andrew accepted to have a chat with me for this channel where we talked yet again about SEASPIRACY. There's been so much said about this movie. There's been reviews on YouTube, there's been tweets, there's been Instagram posts, there's been articles. Because this has been done over and over again, the point of this video is not to talk about the inaccuracies of the movie. We touch on them a little bit at the beginning, but it's mostly to go into the details of some of what the scientists and the NGOs, and yes, even the governments, have been doing to tackle some of the issues that are talked about in the movie. Andrew and I took a deeper dive into some of these issues, and it was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm going to put some sort of timeline or timestamp or whatever in the description below so you can skip to some of the sections you might be most interested in. But I do recommend that you listen to the whole podcast, videocast, whatever you want to call this, because it was actually a fascinating conversation and I really, really enjoyed chatting with Andrew, and I am sure that you will enjoy it as well. I hope you do. Thank you so much for watching, and please go listen to Andrew's podcast as well. Again, it is the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I will put a link in the description below as well. I hope you enjoy this. Thank you so much for watching.
Okay, well, Andrew, thank you so much for being here today. Folks, I'm really happy to have Andrew Lewin, who is the host of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, and who has quite a lot of things to say about SEASPIRACY. So, so I invited you so we could talk a little bit about that. I've listened to some of your podcasts about this, and I thought they were absolutely fascinating. I highly encourage people to go and check out some of these episodes, because really, if you want to know more about some of the issues that are discussed in the movie, Andrew goes really into serious details, and he's got, I don't know how many episodes you have now about
it's never ending. It feels like it's never ending.
And there'll be more. I hope there'll be more because they're fascinating, and as I said, you just really go into depth, so that's great. So yeah, thank you so much for being here and for accepting to have this chat with me.
I appreciate it. I appreciate being on this. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, maybe you want to introduce yourself a bit. I don't know if I've done a good job or if there's anything you want to add.
No, you've done a pretty good job, but I can go into a little bit more detail if you'd like. I am a marine biologist. I've been a marine biologist for the last 20 years. I am now more of a science communicator because I live in Ontario, so it's very difficult to be a podcaster. It's easy to be a podcaster. It's difficult to be a marine biologist in Ontario. I decided to switch to more of a science communication based role by starting a podcast on the ocean for me to keep connected to a lot of the ocean things that I was part of before, a lot of my colleagues, my friends, and so forth. And so I've actually found that having a podcast, I've had more of a change. I've been more of like an agent of change for people who are listening to the podcast about the ocean and the issues and some of the things that we can do to help that ocean more now than I have ever been able to do working for the government or working as an environmental consultant or part of an NGO. So it's been quite the journey so far. 6 years this year.
Oh, so 6 years! Wow.
Yeah, over 1,000 episodes and
wow.
over 1.5 million downloads. So
no way, that's incredible.
Pretty good journey.
Yeah. And I was saying, I'm a little bit ashamed to say, as an ocean lover, but I found your podcast mostly by searching for SEASPIRACY episodes.
Many have.
And I am really happy I found it, because there are so many other interesting episodes about everything ocean related. So I will I am now a devoted fan, and I will continue listening.
Well, thank you. As am I with your podcast as well, or your channel. I guess.
Yeah.
I call everything a podcast now, but definitely your
This
YouTube
is kind
channel.
of like a podcast a bit, so I will call it podcast. That's what I vlogcast. Anyway, I forgot how you're supposed to call these things. But yeah, so what I was hoping to do a bit is that we can talk a bit about the movie. Obviously, I think now people have been talking about it in great lengths. There's a lot of marine biologists that have expressed their opinions on YouTube or on podcasts, such as yourself and such as me and such as many others. And the movie has received quite a bit of, I would call it constructive criticism, but it's divided people a lot. Some people are not understanding why marine biologists are, talking about the various inaccuracies that do exist in the movie. And so I did want to, maybe we can kind of briefly chat about what your thoughts were on the movie, but then I don't want to spend too much time on that either. I'm kind of looking to move to more of a conversation where we can talk about some of the stuff that the movie doesn't really address, such as some of the positive things that NGOs have done to tackle some of these issues, or scientists or even governments. And then maybe address some of the ways that people can help, or what they can do other than, not eating fish, which is not going to solve these problems, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know how to put it, but anyway, it's not obviously it's not a good enough solution. So maybe we can talk about some of the way we can address these problems. So it's a lot to cover, and we don't have that much time. So we'll see how it goes, whether or not we can address all of that. If not, maybe we can have another episode, or maybe I can.
I'm good with that.
Yeah. But yeah, so maybe we can start by you telling us what your take was on the movie a bit, and what, not just the negative stuff, but what you thought. Well, unless there is no positive stuff, but what you thought it did and didn't do. Did it actually increase awareness about certain issues in a constructive way or not? Yeah, just tell us what you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. I feel, the movie itself definitely has ignited a lot of conversation. It really depends on who you are and what type of conversation you've had, but there's no doubt in my mind, and that you can't deny that people are talking about this movie. The people who have seen the movie have definitely rethought their way about fisheries. The people who have not been exposed to overfishing issue in the past, and this is new to them, are definitely rethinking the way they look at seafood. Whether, there are some people who have stopped eating seafood. There are some people who have sort of looked into it a little bit more to find out more information and find out, is the seafood that they've been using or eating, is it sustainable? How do they know? And they've really gone down sort of the rabbit hole of this whole issue. I should say, in a bit of in defense of the film is, although I have my issues with the film, the director, Ali Tribizzi, did try, and I think it's his girlfriend or his wife, I'm not too sure, but they did try and cover a very complex issue. This is not an issue that I feel could be tackled in an hour and a half or just over an hour and a half of a documentary by anybody.
And many aspects within that issue.
Very much so. Like, if you ask David Attenborough, Sir David Attenborough, who's sort of like a god in the sort of marine conservation world, to cover fisheries in an hour and a half documentary, he'd be like, no, this has to be a docuseries. There's no way we can cover it. There's so many issues, from slavery, industrial, international fishing, IUU fishing, all these different, which we'll define in a bit, and we'll go into more detail. There's just so many issues to cover. It's very difficult to tackle everything. And I think one of the I would say the critiques that I've been saying about the movies, he just tried to tackle too much. If he had focused on one aspect, maybe he could have driven the message home a little bit better, and also with a little bit more of a positive spin on it, or even, maybe not as controversial. in terms of some of the issues that he brought up and some of the facts that, quote unquote facts that he brought up and some of the misinformation that people have been critiquing him on. So, so there's that aspect. I just feel like he covered quite a bit. You and I agree on a lot of the misinformation. I felt that, looking at facts went from a marine conservation, marine fisheries. I'm not a fisheries scientist. I feel like I'm more of a generalist. I really focused when I was doing science on marine protected areas and community ecology and so forth. So, looking at it from that point of view and that lens, I felt that there's a number of facts that were either outdated or just he misinformed people on what he wanted. And he wanted an overall narrative of saying, to solve the fisheries problem, there's no such thing as sustainable fisheries. We must stop eating seafood to have any change. And so I think, I've like gone into this in a lot of detail. And, in a utopian world, if we all stop eating seafood, yes, like some fish will probably come back. And many of the fisheries will come back. But in a realistic point of view, it's just not going to happen. There are people who could stop fisheries. And if you can, and you're in a position to do so, please, consider that an issue, like something to do. But if it's not, and you want to continue to eat seafood and you depend on seafood, then I would say look at, which we'll go into later on in the episode, but look at sustainable options. And also the transparency within fisheries is really bad. It's really difficult to tell these days for a consumer who's not informed on fisheries how to really choose sustainable fisheries. So that's a big problem. And I think, overall, it's there's a couple of other things that I had a problem with in the movie. There are some, just a couple. Like, other than the misinformation, there's a number with misinformation, like facts in there, which you've gone through in detail. I've gone through in detail, so I don't think we need to focus on that because we both agree, and a lot of other people that are probably better scientists than you and I, or have been around longer than you and I, have expressed very similar issues. I think the other thing is there's a bit of like a racial undertone in everything. Every time you see a person from Asia, they either are holding a knife or angry, or the police are chasing the director. I think there's a bit of white saviorism where he's going around being like, I discovered this, this hasn't been talked about. Just because it hasn't been talked about in your circles doesn't mean it's not talked about at all. Overfishing has been a big issue for a decade long, like more than one decade, more than two, more than 100 years. It's always been a problem, and it's always been something that we've been trying to solve. So it has been talked about. End of the line. Great documentary that really focused in on how policies, how there are holes in policies and negotiations and fish lobbies and companies that really focused on that. So I highly recommend people watch that documentary as well. So, I think I take offense to the fact that people haven't been talking about it. It just seems like this filmmaker just discovered it and feels like he discovered everything when there have been plenty of movies. The first 15 minutes he went in and he talked about shark water, talked about the Cove, talked about Blackfish, but never mentioned those movies other than the Cove. And interviewed the director of the Cove and the star of the Cove, but never really mentioned what he went through and what's progressed since the Cove, if anything. That would have been cool to have that kind of update. So there's a lot of like that kind of stuff that goes through. I feel like the whole fishery slave sort of segment of the movie was very poorly done. I think it put people in danger, the former slaves who have been through hell, and that's just scratching the surface of what they've probably been through, and they survived. And now, this white male goes in and is more worried about himself and the questioning that he's asking. Am I going to be in trouble? Am I safe by interviewing you? Is it dangerous for me to interview? I think was the quote that he used. Meanwhile, he just leaves Thailand and leaves these poor people who are obviously being monitored according to the film. What happens to them? Like, are they okay? We don't know. Like they've already been through hell and back, and now he's put them potentially at danger. We don't know. So I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. And then I think the biggest issue that I had with the film was the way they threw some great organizations under the bus, with their Tucker Carlson style of interviewing, trying to ask a question that had nothing pertaining to Plastic Pollution Coalition, which is they deal with plastic pollution from land-based sources, which is 80% of the plastic that's in the ocean, and 20% is marine debris such as fisheries and so forth. And they're both big issues. There's no doubt about it. But he made them choose, and he forced people to show that they're not choosing the right one according to him. They caught them off guard, and now their funding is being cut by donators. They've been harassed. They've had to they have to turn off their social media comments because they're getting death threats and they're getting all these harassments and stuff. And it's awful. It's awful. Same with Earth Island Institute. And it's just like all these organizations, same with Oceana, they just talked to a different person. And I think they threw off a lot of people and in terms of that science communication. I did think it exposed some of the things with communication of science that I think we all need to be prepared to answer these types of questions,
That's kind of something I want to ask as well, because one of the main comment I got from people, because obviously the review I did, it was, at least the first one was mostly about pointing out some of the inaccuracies with the movie, because it just irked me. Like, I was watching this and I was thinking, no. Like, I need to say something about this because this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. But people ultimately, one of the main comments I was getting is, why do you keep focusing about what's wrong? In the end, you do agree that there's problems in the fisheries industry. You do agree that illegal fishing is a thing. You do agree that slavery is a thing. So why are you attacking the movie? And this is also another thing, is whatever comments we've made are viewed as attacks. It is not a constructive criticism. It literally is an attack on something that people view as sacred, pretty much. And why don't you focus on the good stuff, right? Because I didn't know anything about this. I mean, I did, but like a lot of people did not, right? And a lot of people say this movie made me aware that these issues exist now, right? And all you do is you just keep spitting at it. You just keep telling me that this fact and this fact and this fact is wrong. And meanwhile, it doesn't change that the underlying issues do exist. So how do you answer that? Because this is, obviously it's something that keeps coming back up, and it's a valid question coming from people who didn't know that these issues existed and who were happily being pescatarians or whatever, and who are all of a sudden horrified. Like, how do you?
I would say they're right in a certain way, but I think they don't understand who we are as scientists. When a big paper, like when a big article comes out, or even before it's even published, it goes through critique. Scientists to a flaw are critical, and we're taught to be critical because we have to critique every single part of the scientific method
and of ourselves.
Every single part of it. Of ourselves. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to be a part of. And I think that's, something that we haven't conveyed enough to the public, is how critical we can be of each other. And it looks like we're being mean. It really does. And it's not that way. I think we are sticklers for facts. We are sticklers for not just like the truth, but what's been published, and to understand how things have changed over time, and how papers are written to be critiqued, and then people will send rebuttals in other journals or the same journal, and there's a whole process to that.
Why do you think it's important to point out these flaws, though, like some of these errors that were in the movie? Like, for example, Ali. He's given some interviews now where he's saying, okay, well, maybe it's not 2048, maybe it's 2060. Irrespective of what the exact date is, the fisheries are not in a good state, etc., etc. So eventually they'll go down. So the final message is the same. We don't need to get caught up on these details, right? So why do you think it's important to get caught up on these details?
Well, because I think it's how those details are interpreted. Because when some people look at the actual purpose of that, is that the fish that are being fished commercially may collapse at 2048. Not all of them. Like you said, it could be 2050, it could be 2025. It all depends. We've seen fisheries collapse before. The cod fishery is probably the most famous collapse. That happened in 1990. If management continues the way on some fisheries, that can happen. But the way it's interpreted, and the way it has been interpreted, is that there are not going to be fish in the ocean. That's the way it's been interpreted. And so if somebody who watches this movie who has no background in oceans, no background in fisheries, and all of a sudden sees this movie and is like, oh wow, like I need to change, I want to make more of a difference. So there are a lot of people who are inspired to make a difference, and that's the one good thing about this movie. With all the flaws that I have with it, all the problems I have with it, it has inspired sort of a new generation, right? Because End of the Line was 10 years ago. That inspired the generation back then. And now it's been 11 years that this has been out, or that End of the Line came out. Now it's a new movie, and let's be honest, there was probably flaws that we had with End of the Line, but this one there's so much misinformation that it arms the people who are inspired with the wrong information, so they don't know where to go. In the movie, they made it look like Oceania didn't know what they were talking about. They made it look like Oceania was working with fisheries, the industry, to be able to fish more. Yet, in interviews after, Ali and his girlfriend Lucy have actually come out and said, no, Oceania's done some great things. Well, why didn't you say that in the film? Because when I tell people, hey, what do you recommend? Like, how do I find out where I go to get fisheries? Well, if I want to buy sustainable food, where do I go? Look at Seafood app, the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch app. Look at your country. Every country has their own seafood labeling system. Look in there. It may not be perfect, but it's better than the alternative of not knowing what fish to go for. So having that, but if they start to, attack the labels, now we're having a problem, because now people really don't know where to go. They attack the dolphin safe tuna label. And although that's not perfect worldwide, in the US, it saves 100,000 dolphins per year. And I covered that in one of my podcasts, where I was like, because I want to find out, like, what is the benefit of this? Before 1990, before this label was put into place in the US, 100,000 dolphins were being killed in the US fishery, right? Because of tuna fishery. Now it's less than 1,000 a year. Now, some people are like, well, 1,000 is too much, 1 is too much. I can get that, but it's better than 100,000 a year. So there's been progress made. And I think what a lot of people with this type of movie, when it comes out, they have this idea that everything should be perfect right away. It's not. Science is not perfect right away. Management is not perfect right away. I mean, we've seen it with this pandemic, that it's not perfect, and you have to take, little by little, steps forward to improve on the process. And that's the scientific process. That's the conservation process. We will not be able to change overfishing overnight. It's not going to happen. We have to take these baby steps. And although, yes, we are in a critical stage for, it feels like everything, climate change, plastic pollution, we still can only make baby steps, because that's how the world changes, is through these small steps. If you want to make bigger changes, I'm not going to detract anybody from trying to make bigger changes, because I want to see those bigger changes. And if you want to do that, I will help you get to where you are. But when you have a movie who attacks the organizations who have been making those baby steps all this time and have created some really big, really great policies. Plastic Pollution Coalition focuses on land-based plastics. They're a coalition of over 700 individuals and organizations, and that have done some great things for policy, that have instituted laws in different states in the U.S., across the U.S., and has inspired other countries to take action, and communities to take action. And I think that's a big benefit, and just because they don't deal with marine debris, like fisheries, like fishing gear and ghost nets, doesn't mean they're not doing great things, and doesn't mean they shouldn't be continuing. We shouldn't be funding them to continue to do those types of things. It's the same thing with Oceania. And to just have one movie that basically disables them from doing that type of work, or they'll be fine eventually.
Yeah, that's what I wonder. What kind of of course this is hard for us to answer, and I think it's hard for them to answer, but do you really think that this is actually going to have an impact on the ability of these organizations to continue their work? Or are people going to withdraw their funding or their support? Or is this a risk?
It's definitely a risk, and it has been a risk. People have taken their funding out. Now, a lot of I can't speak for the organizations, in especially on an individual basis, because I don't know where they get most of their funding. It will be because they're a charity, they will have it on their website, or they will have it available to the public, as they have to have it available to the public. But I have seen people start saying that they will withdraw funding, and I have heard from different organizations who are part of like a project of Earth Island Institute, which is a fiscal sponsor, have had donations taken away, even though they do something completely different, and so that's a risk. It definitely is a risk in the short term. Will it be a risk in the long term? I hope not. I really do hope not, but I can't speak on that because we just don't know. That'll be remain to be seen.
And that's something else that you have an episode about the fiscal sponsors, and I thought that was really interesting because I find that in a lot of documentaries that are a little bit sensationalist, especially if they start going into a conspiracy side of things, there's this tendency to think that your fiscal sponsors determine what your goals are and what you're doing, and especially if it's someone like the Walton Foundation or whatever, which is
yes.
Walmart effectively. I mean, it's the Walmart family.
Yeah.
The idea is if you get funding from them, you're obviously corrupted, and you can't say either you're muzzled or you're corrupted because you're getting money from these people, right? And I thought you had a very, very interesting podcast on that, where you explained a little bit how the fiscal sponsors work and why they are indeed quite necessary for these charities to exist and to actually do their work. And I wondered if you could touch a little bit about that. I mean, of course, people can go to that podcast to get the full picture, but
of course, yeah.
Maybe in a few words, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? Because they do their little Wikipedia search and they're just like, oh my God, look, Earth Island Institute, they're bad.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. I mean, I think what people have to understand is money and funding in the marine conservation world, whether it be fisheries, plastics, climate change, is few and far between. And there are many more organizations out there that compete for a smaller pot, it seems, of money to do their projects. And we're seeing more collaborations on various scales, which has helped. But people want to do good. They want to start an organization, and not a lot of times they won't even get charitable status, because it's very difficult to do charitable status in any country. Doesn't matter if you're part of the European Union, if you're part of the US, you're part of Canada. You have to have somebody or a team of people be able to, on legal purposes, to follow the tax bracket that you're in. If you're part of a charitable status, is you have to put a lot of paperwork in to show that you're getting charitable donations. Who's it from? They need to, those companies or those agencies are saying, hey, we're giving money, but we're giving it for charity, and these are the charitable organizations. And that takes people power to do that. And a lot of these organizations have started, or that continue to start, even the big ones, are small. They have a small staff. And so to be able to dedicate and pay staff to do that is a very difficult thing from a financial perspective, because the money that goes to these organizations are usually on a project by project basis, and only a certain percentage is allowed to go to overhead. That means to pay the staff to do it. So a lot of these organizations like Oceana, they're very lean, leaner than you think, and we just don't realize it. And so imagine if they're lean, how these smaller organizations, how lean they are. So a lot of them become projects, and they need to get funding. They need those charitable donations, but they don't have charitable status. And so what they do is they go to a fiscal sponsor like Earth Island Institute. Tides Canada is one in Canada, and they become a project. They apply, and it's a rigorous process. The institute or the foundation basically comes together and says, okay, we're going to evaluate every project on a project by project basis, and does it follow our values and so forth. And then they'll have funders that they can say, hey, we just brought on this project, would you want to fund? And so they maintain that relationship with the funding agencies, with the foundations, the donors, and so forth. And then they maintain the relationship, sort of like the middle person for the projects. And so they provide a service, which is basically, we make sure that you follow all the tax laws and for charitable status, and you pay a percentage to that organization, that fiscal sponsor that will do that. So, the Earth Island Institute has over 70 projects that they cover, and it covers everything from youth leadership in developing worlds to the dolphin safe label for the tuna fishery, and plastic pollution coalition. So there are a number of things that are not, they probably don't even know about each other, or they probably don't even interact with each other on a daily basis. So to say that the plastic pollution coalition is in cahoots with the dolphin tuna safe label and that they're supporting the fisheries because of that is comparing apples to oranges. They probably don't even, I don't even know if they know each other. I don't, just other than being part of the same fiscal sponsor, you'd be amazed at how many people don't know each other in the marine conservation world just because of geography and stuff.
I didn't know you.
Yeah, exactly. Million and I didn't know each other. And so it's different. So I think it's one of those situations where fiscal sponsors are a very important part of the conservation world, especially marine conservation, where funding is really difficult to take. So you need these fiscal sponsors to take part in it. They are fiscal sponsors, and they do have to be careful of what projects they take on. They have to make sure that it follows their mission, it follows their statements, it follows the ethics, it follows sort of like all the laws and everything, like harassment and occupational health and safety and all that kind of stuff. And they do their due diligence. And to say that somebody's associated with another is very difficult to say because they're part of the same fiscal sponsor. And I just think that, people just didn't understand that. So I want to do I did a whole podcast episode on that, so that I want to inform some of the viewers that come over to my podcast from Seaspiracy to find out more. Like, this is a situation. These are not bad organizations. They may not be perfect. And it'd be great if they could cover, if Plastic Pollution Coalition could cover, marine debris and ghost nets. But they even said it, they don't have the capabilities, they don't have the expertise in their organization. It's a small organization. It's really a coalition. So there's only a few staffers that can do it. And I'm talking about probably under 15 people that can do it. So how do you manage all of that? It's through your coalition. If they don't have anybody in their coalition that deals with ghost nets, you can't speak on ghost nets. It's a very normal thing in science. Like, I'm not going to speak on plastic pollution if I'm not working in the plastic pollution industry. I'm not going to dedicate a whole part of my organization to that if I don't have that expertise. And that's what they did. And they were very transparent about it, but they got judged because of it. Yeah,
they definitely got judged. And the other kind of group of people that got judged were the governments. They don't even get judged in the movie. They're basically kind of labeled as not doing anything. And that's something else that you kind of do cover in another one of your podcasts, I think. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch a little bit on that. There's obviously illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, is a reality. It's something that does happen worldwide. Some fishery scientists argue that it happens in a very specific part of the world. Others kind of argue that it happens a little bit more globally. Irrespective of where it happens, it does happen. And governments have actually been actively, not all of them, but there are many of them that have been actively trying to tackle this and to put an end to it or prevent imports of products that could result from or could be the product of IUU fishing. So that's not something that is mentioned whatsoever in the documentary. The governments are seen as the big evil guys who walk hand in hand with the industry. And again, industry is also something we could define because it's a very generic term. There are many fisheries industry, just not just one fisheries industry. But anyway, is there, what do you have anything to say about how governments around the world, obviously you probably have a few examples of how they might be tackling these issues and whether or not this is something that is working or effective or even legitimate, or is it something we can trust?
Yeah, for sure. I think what we have to do when we talk about policies, and because when it comes to government, it's all done through policies. And some countries have been doing better policies than others in a way. And I think to understand this is you have to realize that when when a government, what a government has control over and what a government doesn't have control over. So every country has their own exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles out from their coastline out to the ocean. They control that area. It's usually federal government that controls that area. In the U.S., I think for the states, it's up to 9 nautical miles, and anything beyond that is the federal government. They have control over implementation of management policies, implementation of enforcement, and so forth. So like the U.S. and Canada will use its Coast Guard as enforcement, and they do a very good job considering how difficult it is even within that 200 nautical mile zone. Like Canada has the longest coastline in the world. It's very difficult to have boats everywhere at every time. So does illegal fishing happen within Canada? Probably. I could say that pretty definite that there's probably something going on that we don't know. Does it happen as a majority of the system? Probably not, because most fishers will follow that because there's too much at stake for them not to follow that. And so within that exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, it's easier to manage your own country's resources. When you go beyond that, you go into international waters. That's where it really gets sketchy, because no one nation or many nations really have authority over that. And that's where we've seen a lot of the conflicts we've seen from whaling to industrial fishing to illegal fishing. The IUU a lot of times will have that. A lot of countries, especially in Asia, have really been focused on it, will have their distant fleet. Even like Portugal has a distant fleet.
The EU has distant fleets. Yeah, there's a lot of EU boats that go fish on the west coast of Africa. And, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and they'll go to various parts of the world and fish a lot of times in international boundaries. Like I know in the past, Canada has had some problems with the Portuguese distant fleet at the border, at the exclusive economic zone, where we've had to station, Coast Guard right at that zone because they keep coming in, they keep fishing cod, and we know the problems with Canada and cod. So, that has been a point of conflict in the past. So, so when it comes to the distant fleet, that's where it really gets sketchy, because they can go anywhere in the world and they can fish, but they can't go into other countries' exclusive economic zones without certain permission or permits if they're actually allowed to have that. And that's where a lot of the illegal fishing happens. And so what will happen is people will catch fish, like boats will catch fish, and they'll come back and either come back to the country and offload, but it's just kind of what you said, the IUU fishing. It could be illegally fished, but there's no way of finding out. It could be unreported, so the country doesn't even know that they've caught it. And it could be unregulated. So where they caught, like that fish maybe not even be under their management kind of policies. And so without having that documentation or knowing where these fish are coming from, those countries can't really crack down. And so the only way they can't crack down is the only fish you can get is if it's legal, if it's reported, and if it's regulated. And so all the other things, there are ways to get around that make it very difficult. And if the country with the distant fleet doesn't crack down on those, that's where it becomes a problem. So there are different ways to deal with that. And I covered that a little bit in my podcast, where certain countries, like it's very difficult for one country to tell another country what to do, right? They could be like U.S. and Canada tell each other what to do. A lot of times they are in it together, but it's very difficult for Canada to be like, to the U.S. you shouldn't be doing this, or for the U.S. to Canada you shouldn't be doing this. And conflicts happen, and we usually work it out because we're neighbors and so forth. And in Europe it probably happens all the time. Oh gosh,
the UK and the rest of Europe, there's been a bit of a fishing war. Yeah.
Exactly, and it happens, right? And so it happens a lot. We hear it more happening in Asia, and that's unfortunate. But the Chinese distant fleet is notorious for illegal fishing, and so recently the Chinese government tried to crack down because they're trying to get a part of all these international agreements. And I think recently they changed it because they want to become, and I forget the name of the agreement, but it's like a port authority agreement. So to get access to different ports. But other countries weren't allowing them because they're like, no, your IUU fisheries it's a mess and we don't trust you. And so what they did is they put into implementation their distant water fleet. They changed their policy. So it used to be if they came back and they got caught for the IUU fisheries, they would get a fine, but they could just turn around and go back out. And it was actually probably cheaper to pay the fine and get the spoils than it was to worry about the fine. And so now with their new policy, some of the highlights is that the captain of the ship will be suspended for 3 years. He or she won't have a captain's license for 3 years, and the manager of the company that's a big deal. Yeah. That's your livelihood for 3 years, right? And the manager of that company that's involved in that sort of is buying from that ship or maybe contracted that ship to go out would also be suspended for 3 years from doing any type of business. So it's a positive thing in a positive way. However, it's very difficult, especially in the West, to know what China is doing. They're very secretive. They don't like to share their information. So how do we know they're going to enforce those rules? How do we know if those rules are actually going to be effective? That's a different thing. And that's where the complexity comes in, right? Is you're trying to tell a different country to do something. It's very difficult that way.
Yeah. But that's super interesting. And I mean, there's so much we could talk about regarding that. I mean, well, you do have a podcast on this again.
Yeah, I do.
You've got a lot.
I should say the one interesting thing that Europe did. So they import a lot of their fisheries from different countries like Vietnam and Taiwan. And I kind of love this because it's a little play on the European football that goes around where they're giving out yellow and red cards to countries based on how much they crack down on their IUU fisheries. So I think Vietnam was in a red card for a while. I think at the time that I covered the story, Taiwan was coming off a red card and going into a yellow card, and when
they call it the carding scheme.
The carding scheme, yeah. And when you're a country that exports almost 50% of your catch to the European Union, that makes a big difference on your GDP, right? So it kind of forces them to do something about it.
What's very interesting with the carding scheme is that they also have capacity building. So they don't just issue a red card and they say, well, you can no longer import into the EU because, your fish might be coming from illegal fishing. They actually do offer resources for them to try and tackle these issues of illegal fishing, and it's not always successful. And if it's not successful, these cards, these red cards or orange cards kind of stay on. But if they do manage to tackle, there's these auditors that just go into these countries and see whether or not they've managed to work around these issues, and if they have, or if it's deemed acceptable, then those cards might be lifted. It has, the carding scheme is a little bit, there are some people who are not really happy about the way it works within the fisheries community, fisheries science community. But I think that it is a good example of how the governments do indeed try to tackle some of the issues and prevent the illegal fishing from entering the market. So, right. I think that's good. That's a very good example. I could talk about this forever, but it's already been more than 40 minutes. So I just kind of wanted to move on to some of what people can do or how they should approach these issues. So obviously, we've already mentioned, if enough people stopped eating fish, or if the world stopped eating fish, these issues wouldn't exist. Right. They would exist elsewhere, most likely, because that means we wouldn't be eating fish, we would be eating something else. So, we do need to feed the world. And as we discussed before starting the episode, there is a lot of issues with the food industry in general and lots of discard. So if we could manage that, whether it's discards of vegetables or fish or anything else, that would already be a big step forward. But the reality is that still exists in any of the food industries. And but Ali, nonetheless, kind of gives this final message of stop eating fish. So, if enough people stopped eating fish, do you think that would actually solve any of the issues that are discussed in the movie, or not?
Well, I just don't think it's realistic that people will stop eating fish. Right off the bat, I just don't think it'll happen. I mean, I think it can happen more in the Western world where people will stop eating fish, or more people will stop eating fish. And if that's what this movie does, and if that's what the point of this was, and it sounds like what Ali is saying is that people in sort of the Western world, what he calls his audience for the movie.
It seems very targeted all of a sudden, because now he's done a number of interviews and he's saying, but you don't get it. It's only for a specific kind of people. And it's like, right. Oh, that was the grand plan. It's only for a specific kind of people.
Yeah, it'd be nicer if he mentioned it in the movie, but it sounds like he was trying to paint, like the movie itself painted a simple solution of stop eating fish because no fishery is sustainable. The first thing is there are sustainable fisheries. Whether he likes it or not, there are sustainable fisheries. He talked about how there's no definition of sustainability. There is a definition of sustainability, and it's looking at the maximum sustainable yield. And it's based on a lot of data. It's a lot of information. Yes, it's a model. There are some assumptions that are put into it, but it's pretty robust, and it's worked in the past. It's all about the management and implementation of a management and enforcement, which is a difficult task to do. So for some fisheries more than others. But the thing is, the reality is that you're looking at 80, and Daniel Pauly said it, Dr. Daniel Pauly said it great in a Vox article that he said is the reality is that 85% of the world relies on seafood of some sort. And so to be able to suggest that the world, which is what the movie indicated, was that the world stop eating seafood is just unrealistic. If people in the West can stop eating seafood, if they're in the ability to choose that and they want to do that, that's great. I fully back them. I fully support their decision. I'm not going to say, don't eat fish if you don't want to eat fish. That's fine. If this movie makes you not want to eat fish, that's fine. But if you don't eat fish because you don't think there's a sustainable option, then look up, do the research. It's not going to be easy because there's a lot of problems with what's sustainable. There's problems with seafood fraud, and there are a lot of problems. But there are apps that can help you with those. There are organizations that can help you with those, and so you can find sustainable fisheries. I mentioned in my podcast a number of times there are more and more companies that are popping up that it's almost like they're community supported fisheries where you can support. You can go down to knowing who is like the family that's getting your fish, how they caught it. And there's a whole profile in the family and it comes right to you. So they cut out a lot of the middle companies, middle people, and it goes right to there and you're supporting your own community. In fact, in the UK over the pandemic, there was a sort of like a fisheries, you can call it industry, but I would say collective that kind of popped up. It was working with a marine marketing agency, and the UK import most of their seafood. Well, they couldn't import most of their seafood. That was because of the pandemic. And so I think it was the Cornwall Fisheries Association was able to show what type of sustainable fisheries that they had. In the UK waters that they didn't have to import and people could support them. So they were able to keep their jobs. People were able to get delivery right to the door and see who's actually catching their food. And that's happening now more in the US. We're seeing that pop up more. We're seeing more exposure of those companies. And I think it's a tool in the tool belt, just like not eating seafood is a tool in the conservation tool belt. But also when you look at the rest of the world, policies and enforcement are probably the biggest tools that will help shape the way we fish in the future.
Just to go back to what you're saying here about the kind of local fishing and local fisheries initiatives and industries, what is wrong about the way we consume fish right now? Because clearly, some people will continue eating fish. And they may want to know, I've had people reach out to me and ask me, well, what fish can I eat? Mm-hmm. And in a way, to me, it's not so much about what fish can you eat. It's about understanding what is wrong with the way you're currently consuming your fish. I personally don't eat fish because I think it's kind of complicated to navigate, but there are ways to navigate it. And, what's your take on what is, we're eating a lot of salmon. We're eating the same thing all the time, no matter what the season is, no matter where we are. We buy our fish at the supermarkets, right? So, how do we move from that? How do we make sure we consume the right fish?
I would say you start to diversify your palate for seafood. Like you said, we are marketed, and it's not just our fault, is we are marketed and told what seafood we like based on what's available. I go to my local Costco and it's going to be farm salmon, wild salmon, and a lot of other fish that are they're maybe haddock, halibut, cod.
Is there cod in Canada?
Yeah, cod from different places in the world. But the problem with that is it's always the same type of fish.
And people always want the same type of fish.
Exactly, because we're told to want the same type of fish. Let's be honest, there's no such thing as a Chilean sea bass. right? It's the Antarctic toothfish. Somebody got savvy and said people like the word sea bass. And if you show a picture of what a Chilean sea bass looks like, they're not a very good looking fish, right? They're called a toothfish for a reason, you know? And so they don't look as palatable. And I think there's a lot in that marketing to really what drives us home and really understand, you know, what we're being driven to. And what was one thing that was interesting is there's a friend of mine who has a podcast called the Fish Nerds. And he was part of a citizen science project with the New England Aquarium. He lives in New Hampshire, and with the New England Aquarium. And essentially what it was, he would get a list every week. Or is it every month? I don't know the frequency, but he'd get a list, and it was a list of what was locally available that was sustainable for fisheries. So something that could be caught local, and something that's shown that there could be a sustainable fishery for them, or there is a sustainable fishery for them. And they had to go to their supermarkets and fish markets and ask for those particular things. And a lot of the times they weren't on it, and because the demand wasn't there. And so knowing that, you know, we're missing out on a lot of seafood that we could be diversifying in, and by doing that, we might lower the pressure on other species that have a better marketing scheme towards. So, you know, I think when we look at it from that perspective, we really need to start looking at diversifying our palate, which will take some research. If you really want to eat seafood, you're going to have to in this day and age, you're going to have to do your research. You know, and you're really going to have to understand how fish are caught, where they're caught, and how to get it. And just in that will deter people from eating seafood. But what I don't want them to do is go back to the regular way of eating seafood. You know, the way we're consuming seafood is not good. And so that needs to change. So hopefully like a movie like this will, you know, drum up this type of conversation. Instead of just going from I'm not going to eat seafood, is I'm going to eat seafood in a more informed way. If you do decide to eat seafood, or you have to eat seafood, then that's where we can go from there.
Yeah, or if you're a chef who wants to continue putting seafood on the menu, then how do you go about this? How do you, yeah, that's really, really, I mean, as I said, I could go on about this forever, but we do need to put an end to this already. I feel like we've talked for 5 minutes, but it's been 50 minutes.
Yeah, I know. You and I can talk about this forever.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So just, these are I think, very, very interesting insight, and that's why I really wanted to talk to you, because I think you got a lot to say about this, and you know what you're talking about. So it's really, really interesting to hear your point on this, because there's a lot of these nuances that are missing in the movie and that people are asking for. So hopefully you can continue to provide that through your podcast. Hopefully I might be able to continue providing that on my channel. I also do need to focus on my PhD, so we'll see.
I think too, is like a lot of scientists, I think we all start to need to do PhDs on communication as well to be able to afford more time to doing this. But I just want to say, I want to thank you for doing this YouTube channel. Like, as someone who's in science communication, it's not an easy thing to do, especially a YouTube channel where it provides a lot of editing process and a lot of research to do it properly. It's a lot of work, and I don't think people realize how much work it is to do something like that.
Oh, no, I've been told many times, if you're not happy about the movie, why don't you make it yourself? And I'm like, because I've got a job and I already work every weekends and evenings, and I don't know when I would find the time. Like,
yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing is too, is like, I think that as controversial as this movie is, for people to understand more about the controversy, like what is the controversy, is to understand that, and don't take offense to the scientists who are coming in and critiquing it. There are parts that I hate about the movie, but I'm happy that people are talking about the movie, or talking about fisheries, not necessarily the movie, but about fisheries. And I think that's what maybe we didn't convey, like right off the bat, and maybe we should have as a science community, is be like, look, I'm glad people are talking about fisheries. And that gets lost sometimes in the translation of, hey, you must be part of the fisheries industry. But the problem with having a movie like this is it definitely drives a wedge between the public and the scientific community. Yeah,
that's the problem. Right? And you don't want to create this gap. You don't want to create this war I mean, it's almost like we're waging war against each other, which is crazy because it's a lot of energy. It's a lot of time spent to fighting your ally against a common cause, and it's like, why are we doing this? It's like, maybe we don't have the same approach to this final goal of ours, which ultimately is to protect our oceans and make sure it's plentiful and beautiful. But it's okay. We can have different approaches to getting there, right? We don't need to agree on everything. But like the fact that people are attacking each other right now is very disturbing. Well, I'm going to have to wrap this up, but thank you so much, Andrew, for your input and for coming on my channel. It's fascinating, and I wish we didn't have to stop, but we do, at some point, we do need to go,
yes,
feed ourselves.
Get on with our lives.
Get on with our lives.
For sure.
But yeah, thank you. And maybe we'll chat again, hopefully.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to chatting more.
Awesome. All right. Bye.